as I said last week, we're going to get back right back into it. As I said last week, the many editors we have had of the multitudinous volumes and renditions of the Scripture over the last couple of centuries have left us, with in a lot of confusion. As we began to see last week, even out of 1 Peter chapter 4, the editors have made a message that was very, very inclusive, very expressive of the all-inclusive love of God for all of humanity, and they've turned it into an evangelical fundamentalist explanation of exclusion rather than inclusion. And anyway, we're going to look back over a little bit of that today and go on a little bit further. If you go with me to 1 Peter chapter 4, I know some of you weren't here, and that message, we weren't online last week. That message will be placed up in our archives soon, and it may be necessary for you to go back and listen to that, watch that if you weren't here. Verse 1, therefore, since Christ suffered for us, this is 1 Peter chapter 4, by the way, if I didn't say that. Therefore, since Christ suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same mind, for he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. And I'm going to talk about that probably next week, because that doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. He who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. But I think next week I'm going to be able to show you what's being spoken of here. That he no longer should live in the rest of his time in the flesh for the lusts of men, but for the will of God. For we have spent enough of our past lifetime in doing the will of the Gentiles, when we walked in lewdness, lust, drunkenness, revelries, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries. In regard to these, they think it strange that you do not run with them in the same flood of dissipation, speaking evil of you. They will give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. For this reason, the gospel was preached also to those who are dead, that they might be judged according to men in the flesh, but live according to God in the Spirit. But the end of all things is at hand. Therefore be serious and watchful in your prayers, and above all things have fervent love for one another, for love will cover a multitude of sins. Be hospitable to one another without grumbling. As each one has received a gift, minister it to one another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. If anyone speaks, let him speak as the oracles of God. If anyone ministers, let him do it as with the ability which God supplies, that in all things God may be glorified through Jesus Christ, to whom belong the glory and the dominion forever and ever. Amen. We're going to stop right there for the moment, but we're going to go on with this chapter in a little bit. And like I said, next week, I'm going to take what we've taught this week and what we taught last week, and I'm going to try to give a little bit more understanding to what that first verse is referring to when it says, he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. Because a lot of us have spent a lot of time suffering in the flesh, so to speak, and we still continue to blow it. Isn't that right? So what in the world can that mean? Well, hopefully we'll talk about that next week. But anyway, as we saw last week in these first 11 verses, Peter was a subscriber to the one another directive of Jesus. Now, right, we saw that. And not simply in the arena of familiar Christendom where most of us have been, learning to love one another within the church, learning to be kind to one another within the family, within the, the familiar Christendom. But Peter specifically goes on with regard, and he's talking about with regard to those in verse 4, those who think you strange, who speak evil of you, and of course, really, provide a lot of opposition to you. That's who he's really emphasizing here as he goes on into verses 8 through 10. We'll get there in a moment. So when we arrived at verse 10, we see that Peter was actually giving instruction to these believers that he's writing to about how to react to those from verse 4 who were misusing, abusing, speaking evil, and stirring up opposition to him. So he's speaking to a group of believers who, of course, many believers in those days were that way, but he's speaking to a group of believers who have become targets of the evil intentions, of the unbelieving surroundings, right? And he's telling them specifically that they are to cover the many sins. If you go on into verse 8, above all, have fervent love for one another, for love will cover a multitude of sins. He's telling these offended believers, that they are to cover the many sins of the perpetrators with fervent love. I want to make sure we get that, because this isn't just about us forgiving somebody in the church who has done something that we've taken offense to. He's got a specific group of people in mind here, those who have been actually providing opposition to Christianity, to the church, to you, to what you believe, you know. And he's saying you are to cover the many sins of the perpetrator with fervent love. And this word fervent here is a word that means intentional and earnest. Intentional and earnest, right? Now, in the Gospel of John, where we find the one another directive of Jesus spoken several times, the recorded directive of Jesus is simply love one another. But lest we, not understand the full intention of Jesus, John and Paul and Peter have all gone into great depths in their instructions later on through the epistles, right? And they've been careful to tell us what this looks like, what it means when Jesus said, love one another. So if you haven't grown weary of this yet, I'm going to one more time read you from the list that is expounded upon, where the apostles are expounding upon Jesus' love one another directive and telling us what we are to understand about what Jesus meant, because this is something that had come into their hearts with great revelation. So let me read you this one more time. These are the things that are the prescribed behaviors of the New Testament, okay, specifically of these apostles, to the one another, to our one another encounters, right? Love one another 16 times. Have peace with one another. Be affectionate with one another. Give preference to one another. Do not judge one another. Receive one another. Admonish one another. Minister to one another. Have the same care for one another. Serve one another. Bear with one another, twice. Be kind to one another. Submitting to one another. Forgiving one another. Teaching one another. Admonishing one another. Comfort one another, twice. Edify one another, twice. Exhort one another. Consider one another. Confess one another. Pray for one another. Have compassion for one another. Be hospitable to one another. Do not speak evil of one another. 43 elaborations by the apostles on the words of Jesus, love one another. 43 times they felt the need to, now I actually that's misleading, because about 8 of those love one another's were from Jesus in the Gospel of John. But just overall, let's say we have 43 elaborations on the Jesus directives, on the Jesus measures. This is what the apostles intended that we understand. This is what they understood from their time with Jesus, from observing Jesus, from walking with Jesus, and from being a little bit resentful at times of the way Jesus treated people. Thinking, man, these people don't deserve what you're doing for them. But anyway, they had learned something. So we have these 43 elaborations that I just read you, lest we miss the point of love one another. And as we're seeing in Peter, this love one another, of course, we can go back again to Jesus, and we should go back to Jesus and realize that the emphasis of Jesus was always primarily upon what? Your enemy. Certainly your neighbor, but many times your neighbor becomes your adversary. Your brother becomes your enemy. He always made those connections. But you see, even Jesus, or I shouldn't say even Jesus, Jesus started this whole thing by introducing a new way of thinking about our response and our relationships with one another. Right? The one another that Jesus had in mind, first and foremost, was the one another who had really gotten under your skin and irritated you and who was your enemy socially, religiously, politically, whatever it was, nationally, whatever. That was the one that Jesus really had in mind, because Jesus certainly knew, well, it's so much easier for Mike to love Bruce, because Mike and Bruce, they may have a little disagreement once in a while, but that's not what I want to emphasize. I don't need to say Mike loved Bruce. What I need to say is, Mike, love your enemy, right? And so lest we, as we get back over here into 1 Peter chapter 4, we need to realize that all of those 43 elaborations that I just read to you were the understood meaning of love one another, but it was understood that, as Peter is doing here, that it was to be those who have spoken evil of you, those who have stirred up opposition to you, those who have, who think you strange, And so anyway, well then Peter, in this passage that we're looking at right now, he elaborates on love here when he says in verse 9, be hospitable. This word means generous. Be generously hospitable to your offenders. I'm plugging that in there, but now we understand that. Be generously hospitable to your offenders. He says without grumbling. Without grumbling. And that word grumbling there means without secret displeasure. Did you get that? That means don't just do this under compulsion because your pastor said so, or even because Jesus said so. Don't do it because Jesus said I got to do it. See, without secret displeasure. Okay, I won't grumble, but you know what? I may be sitting down on the outside, but I'm standing up on the inside, right? That's what this means, without that attitude, right? Okay. So in other words, he's talking about doing it from the heart because this is what you know to be the strategy for victory and success in all relationships around the world. All right? So it's from the heart. It's not under compulsion. And then Peter further dilates, love as serving. This version says minister in verse 10, serving the needs of the opposition. And I've given you that out of the New American Standard, was as each one has received a special gift, let him employ it in serving one another, as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. So, as I said, now here Peter is again dilating this concept of love when he says, serve the needs of your opposition. Well, what are the needs of my opposition? Well, he makes it very clear here. The one thing those in opposition to you need is the manifold grace of God. That's all they need from you, nothing less. They don't need anything more because there is nothing more you can give them in terms of real quantitative, qualitative gifting, right? The manifold grace of God. He said that's what you're to serve to your opposition. Well, of course, manifold means many faceted, so we could go off into a long series on that. But you understand what I'm saying. He's telling us what the needs of our opposition are. So we're to love. We're to be generously hospitable from the heart without any kind of secret displeasure. And we're to serve the needs, the true needs, the real needs of the perpetrators against us, and what they need is what? The manifold grace of God, right? All right. Now, last week we saw, and those of you that weren't here, we'll go through a little bit of this real quick, but last week we saw that Peter made his case for this love treatment. I'm going to call it the love treatment, But by first reminding, maybe informing, but hopefully just reminding, his audience, of the inclusion of these temporary enemies of the gospel of Christ. I want you to get a hold of that because, even though Peter hasn't said it in that terminology, I want you to realize that we're talking about people who are temporary enemies to the gospel, right? Now, we have, of course, allowed the evangelical fundamentalist, persuasion to put us into a mindset of the permanent enemies of the cross. But what we have is temporary, all around us in the world, we have temporary enemies to the gospel. I want us to get that right. So in other words, and here's what we said, and here you may have to, if you weren't here last week, follow me closely here. Here's what he said, in spite of their verse 4 behaviors. Let's go back to verse 4, right? In spite of the fact that they walk in lewdness, lust, drunkenness, I'm sorry, not that. In spite of the fact that they speak evil of you and stir up opposition to you, the next verse seems to set things right from our fleshly desire. Don't worry about it, is what we've been taught to hear here. They'll give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. That's what we've been taught. That's where our confidence is. That's where our peace is found, in realizing that those who screw with us are going to be screwed with eternally. Right? Yeah, come on. That's where our joy has been. They got theirs coming. As we said last week, we've been taught that when you live the life of verse 3, drunkenness, lust, revelries, blah, 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 you're going to pay the piper in verse 5. Right? Okay? But here's the thing. Peter's doing something entirely different. He's saying, in spite of their behavior towards you, their opposition, their evil speaking, all of these things, then verse 5 in several versions actually starts with the word but, which means nevertheless or to the contrary. So in spite of, now this is where our editors have taken an obviously, from the Greek, have taken an obviously inclusive statement and made it an exclusive statement. All right? So it says, in spite of their verse 4 behavior, nevertheless, they will give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. Now, the word account here, and I'm sorry for those of you that were here last week, but we need to go over this. I think it'll be good for you anyway. Okay? They will give an account. The word account here is logos. What do we know about the word logos? It means, it means the word. It means the structure of reality, right? We've learned that logos is the structure of reality. So in other words, they will give an account of the structure of their reality, right? Now, who is the structure of reality? Jesus alone, right? And they will give an account. We saw over in Hebrews chapter 4, I think it's verse 13, it says that all things are open and laid bare. Now listen, I'm going to give you the correct wording of this verse, okay? Because the New King James says, with whom we must give account. Again. But it's the same word over there, logos, and the actual literal of that says, all things are open and laid bare with whom, to him with whom is our account. In other words, he is our structure of reality. He is our logos. Same word. So in other words, this is Peter's way of saying in verse 5 here what Paul said over in Philippians, every knee shall bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, not to the embarrassment of those who denied it on earth, but to the glory of God the Father. Right? See, again, the editors have led us to believe that every knee shall bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to their embarrassment. They blew it while they had the opportunity. Now no more, right? But that's not what Paul was saying. That's not what Peter was saying. Peter was saying, listen, I want you to understand something about these people that are standing in opposition to you. That while they are right now creating difficulty for you, while they are right now, as he started out in verse 1, causing suffering amongst you, you need to understand these are your brothers. They will, nevertheless, they will give an account. They will give the same account to him, of him, that you will give. That's what's being said here. They're going to give the same account to him that you will give to him, that he is indeed Lord of the living and the dead. It says, of him who is ready to judge, who is ready to judge. Listen to this. The word judge here means to select, to choose, to approve, to esteem, to prefer, to rule, to govern. So they will give an account to him who is ready to select, choose, approve them, esteem them, prefer them, rule, and govern over the living and the dead. That's a pretty strong statement, isn't it? Wow, have we been deceived by the editors of death, by the editors of separation and exclusion. Isn't that right? Of course, Peter was an inclusionist. Why wouldn't he have been an inclusionist? He traveled with the greatest inclusionist of all, right? And yet there's many things that have been rendered, to express exclusion rather, right? All right, so, let me look. You know this from when we were in our judgment series, but go over to Acts 17:31 real quick. Let me read this to you. Keep your hand here. It's because he has appointed a day on which he, referring to the Father, will judge the world in righteousness, and this version says, by the man whom he has ordained. He has given assurance of this to all by raising him from the dead. Now, I told you this a long time ago. It's exactly the same word rendered in and by. This word is rendered 1,902 times in, I-N. It is rendered only 163 times by. But the editors thought, well, how can we express, the inevitable separation for those who have denied Christ unless we say they're going to be judged by him? But this is what it says. It says, he has appointed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness. He will judge the world to be in righteousness, right? In the man. In the man. Right? He has made him to be unto us wisdom from God, righteousness, sanctification. Every day. We have been judged righteous in the man. Not by the man, in the man. Get that? See, that's what Paul said here too. He's saying the same thing that Peter is talking about over here in chapter 4 and verse 5. So he says, they will give an account to him. All right, now what Peter is saying here in verse 5 is revealed in verse 7 as this. Look at verse 7. But the end of all things is at hand. Now that is ominous. That is apocalyptic sounding. If you have come into this thing with the evangelical fundamentalist persuasion that these suckers are going to pay in verse 5, and by golly, the end of all things is at hand, and they're in deep, deep, deep stuff, right? Okay? So when you hear it that way, it's kind of hard. But as I told you last week, the word end here is the Greek word teleos, and it's a word that never means the end of an age. That's a different word. That's the word suntelea in the Greek, all right? So this word end is a word that means goal, aim, or purpose. So he's saying the goal of all things is at hand. The aim or the purpose of all things is at hand. Remember his own purpose, which was given to us in Christ Jesus before time began? His aim was what? See? That the purpose and the grace of God would be given to all humanity, and it was given before time began. And that's what he's saying. Say, the end, the goal, the aim, the purpose of God has been fulfilled. It's at hand. It is finished. There's nothing more to do. That's what he's saying. So instead of seeing these people as a separate group of people who will be judged, punitively at some point in time, begin to understand that these are, in fact, part of our family. These are your brothers and your sisters. These are people who are walking in the same darkness that you've been walking in. And by the way, you're not completely out of it yet. You're still in the shade. You know what I'm saying? I tell you what, God must look at us sometimes and feel like I felt yesterday morning for a little bit. Off and on for several years, I've coached little elementary school basketball teams. And I got to tell you, this year, I've got 10 boys on the team. 5 of those boys, including Avery, my grandson, are basketball players in the making. 5 of these kids, I don't know how they tie their shoes. They're sweet boys. They're wonderful boys. I enjoy them at practice. They're driving me nuts. And with me, when I coach, everybody plays equal time. And so trying to find a combination of 2 uncoordinated and 3 coordinated, and of course, then the other group goes in is 3 uncoordinated and 2 coordinated. Trying to find a combination that works is frustrating. I'm smacking myself in the head saying, I love these kids. They're wonderful kids. They're all going to play. I'm not going to give in to the idea we got to win most, And the team we played yesterday, was the same way. The coach was the same way. But I look at that thing and I'm thinking, oh, God must think the same about us. What a bunch of uncoordinated doofuses, Do you know that in all the years that I've coached youth basketball, this is way off track, but in all the years that I've coached youth basketball, going clear back to when Caleb and Jeremy played in middle school, in elementary school and stuff, going clear back to that, I have never had an elementary school team score less than 12 to 14 points in a game. And that's, and that's even, yesterday we lost 3-2. So as I said, the other coach was in the same boat I am, Oh, wow, frustrating. And I thought, I bet you Jesus does a head slap every so often and says, 3-2, they're up, Lord, Father. Anyway, I don't know why I got off on that, but point is, I love these boys, and they're all great fun, and I just really enjoy them, And I know God loves all these, but see, that's what we're dealing with. This attitude of we need to sit this bunch on the bench because they just can't measure up, right? And that's the way, judging by the flesh, sees things. This bunch deserves to be on the bench. These people are in the game, So we've, anyway, I don't know. But so what he's saying is, though, is that the purpose of God, the grace of God, given to humanity from before time began, is at hand. In other words, it has been fulfilled in Christ, right? There's nothing more to be done. And so he says in verse 5 and again, or verse 7, again, coming from the New American Standard, therefore, why for? Because the purpose of all things is fulfilled. Because it has all been consummated in Christ, because it is finished, therefore, he says, be of sound judgment. That's what the New American says, and that's a correct rendering. Be of sound judgment. In other words, judge all things the way God does, not as men do. Because the fulfillment is at hand, because Jesus has accomplished that which was the purpose of God from before time began, because these are, while they are living in opposition to you, they are nevertheless going to give the same account before him that you will give before him, see? So begin to think with sound judgment. Think as the Father thinks. You hear that? About these people. Quit thinking the way the world thinks. Quit thinking the way evangelical, fundamentalist, word of faith, grace preachers think. And what? Have sound judgment and have fervent love. Have fervent love for all, as God does. See, think as God does. All right, let's go on to verse 11, down to verse 11. If anyone speaks, let him speak as the oracles of God. If anyone ministers or serves, let him do it as with the ability which God supplies, that in all things God may be glorified through Jesus Christ, to whom belong the glory and the dominion forever and ever. All right, let me give you a little bit of a paraphrase. What he's saying here is, if you're going to say anything about folks, say what God says. That's what that means when it says, if anyone speaks, let him speak as of the oracles of God. It just means if you're going to say anything about people, about these folks, these verse 4 folks will say, if you're going to say anything about them, say what God says about them, not what your flesh says about them. Right? And he says, and he goes on, and he says, talking about if you're going to minister, let him do it with the ability that God supplies. He's saying, if you're placed in a position to serve the unbearable, you need to rest assured that God, who has directed you to love them, will release his strength or his ability into the service that you render to accomplish his results, that he may be glorified. See, we so often draw back from things because, first of all, we can't see how it can come about. We can't see how this little action on my part could possibly create a major change again. Okay, when we're talking about the familiar surroundings of Christendom, maybe we can imagine if I just treat Nancy with a little more respect and a little more love and so on and so forth, Nancy will finally come around. Well, she thinks she needs that from me anyway. I know that's why I picked on her, because I've heard her whining about how I don't respect her. No, not really. But I mean, we do that in the church. That's okay. If I'm just a little bit kinder to somebody, then maybe they'll keep tithing. Did you get that part? I'll just check it. Okay. But you know what I'm saying? But see, that's not what's being emphasized here. That's what I want to get hold of, right? He said, but what God is saying is, look, when you do what I've asked you to do without any hidden agenda, when you can fervently love the opposer, when you are willing to put yourself into being generously hospitable, to the offender, when you are willing to serve the needs of the opposition, then I want you to know something. You're not in it alone. You're just stepping out and providing a vessel for me to then release my strength through. Now, when you're doing these things because the pastor told you to, or just because Jesus said so, or because the scripture plainly says, yeah, you really can't probably expect the same result. Not because God's withholding, it's because you're not really, what I'm saying? So he's given us some understanding here of why, on the one hand, why we don't see things changing. Well, I've tried loving her. I tried being kind. Try not, do, right? In the famous words of the apostle, what's his name? Yoda. Yeah, okay. All right. But it says that you can rest assured. You can rest assured that he'll release his strength into the service that you render. He'll put himself into that to produce his result, that he may be glorified, or in other words, that he might be seen and known. That's what to be glorified means here, that he might be recognized in there. See, he wants to be recognized in what we're doing. He said, this is the way you can cause me to be recognized in people's lives. When you love someone that knows they're unlovable, or that knows they're in opposition with you and you love them anyway, they recognize God in your life. If it's a consistent, faithful thing I'm talking about, right? They begin to recognize something in you, and they begin to yearn for it, so that he might be seen and known for his grace, his inclusive nature, that he might be rightly esteemed, and it all begins with when we do. When we do. Let me read you this again. Remember we were over here a long time ago, but somewhere, I marked the note here so I come back to it. Over in John chapter 5, in verse 23, that all should, it said the Father, verse 22, it said, the Father judges no one, but has committed all judgment to the Son, that all should honor the Son, and I told you that's you, that all should honor the Son, just as they honor the Father. He who does not honor the Son does not honor the Father who sent him. And here's what that says, that they should all rightly estimate and fix the appropriate value upon the Son. See, that's what honor means. And then he said, he who does not rightly estimate the Son, he who does not fix the appropriate value on you does not affix the right value on the Father. That's what it's all about. Us living in such a way that when people receive of fervent love, of generous hospitality, see, of the manifold grace of God through us, when they know that we are in contention, when they know that they stand in opposition to us, when they receive that from us, they begin to fix a different value upon us. They begin to esteem us in a different light. But the purpose of all that is that they esteem our Father in right light. Isn't that right? That they begin to see the Father that we sang about that never leaves them alone. The Father whose power is big in them, whose love is all-inclusive, that they begin to see this. See that the Father may be glorified. All right, so let's go on now. Let's go down to verse 12 over here back in 1 Peter chapter 4. Beloved, do not think it strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you as though some strange thing happened to you, but rejoice to the extent that you partake of Christ's sufferings, that when his glory is revealed, you may also be glad with exceeding joy. Beloved, do not think it strange concerning the fiery trial. Let me give you my paraphrase, okay? There's plenty more evil speaking and abuse where that came from, right? So do not think it strange. Now, these words, think it strange, this phrase means to take up lodging or to stay as a guest. So here's what Peter's saying. In light of what you're learning about this all-inclusive gospel, don't let the trials imposed upon you by these temporary opponents take up lodging within you. Don't let them remain as guests within you. Why? Because that will give birth to resentment, to bitterness, to retributive desire, won't it? See what he's saying? In light of what I've been sharing with you about the all-inclusive love of the Father, about the gospel that was preached even to the dead, so that they might know that even while they were judged in the flesh, remember the passage, by men, they might live in the Spirit with their Father. Right? So even when you're learning these things, and yet you encounter the offense of these people over and over again, don't let it remain there and take up lodging within you. Immediately dismiss it and go back to doing verses 8, 9, and 10. Have fervent love, an intentional love. All right? He says, rather rejoice in verse 13. Rather rejoice as you faithfully receive their abuse as Christ did. That's what he's saying in verse 13. And how did Christ receive humanity's violence? Well, loving them fervently, being generously hospitable to the end, serving them always and only the manifold grace of God. And as it says over here in chapter 22 and verse 23, when he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but committed himself to him who judges righteously. So that's what it's saying, rejoice. Don't let these things take up permanent lodging in you. Don't let them remain as a guest, because what they do is they will spawn bitterness and resentment and retributive desires, vengeance, okay? And then it goes on to say, going back here now, so that but rejoice to the extent that you partake of Christ's suffering, that when his glory is revealed, you may also be glad with exceeding joy. When his glory is revealed. What's that mean? What's that speaking to? Okay? It means that when his glory is revealed. Oh, that's got to mean when Jesus comes again. The second coming, when his glory. No. It's not what it means at all. It means that when the opposition, the perpetrators, when they begin to see him as he is, you may also be glad. Did you get that? Right? See, folks, we need to understand this entire passage for what it is, okay? It's a strong confirmation that the Jesus measures, the Christ directives, never fail. You get that? That's what this is all about. This is a confirmation from Peter that this stuff never fails. Because what? Love never fails, right? Love never fails. And this is a confirmation of that. In other words, when you and I accept, really accept, that all are included, okay? There's still so much bickering and back and forth argument going on in places like Facebook, about whether all are included. And is he a universalist? Is he an inclusionist? Is he a... I should tell these people on Facebook, they just keep passing the same information around the same group of people who are having the same debates and the same agreeable people and the same disagreeable people. And I think, why don't you get a damn job? Why don't you get a job, leave your computer lay there for a while, go out and get amongst people? Why don't you go do something with some people? Some people who need to know about the manifold grace of God. Not a bunch of Christians who are going to debate you from now until eternity about universalism and inclusion and exclusion and separation. And who cares about those people? I don't really care about them anymore. I'm so tired of reading them. Just passing the same information around all the time. Same people, even some of the people that you and I like and have had here at the church, they just keep passing the same information around. Well, so just quit it. Go get a job. Anyway. But anyway, when you and I, let's go back to what I was saying here. This is a strong confirmation that when you and I do finally really accept that all men are included, and we begin to faithfully judge all things as God judges. Remember Paul? We judge thusly, that one died for all, therefore all died. And if one died for all, they that live should no longer live for themselves, but for him who died for them, right? Okay. All right, so when we accept that all are included, we begin to faithfully judge all things as God does, when fervently loving, being generously hospitable from our hearts, serving our opponents, saying only what the Father says about them, putting our trust in the ability of God, not in human reasoning about how things are going to work out. We don't ever do that, do we? Here's the assurance that he gets it. They will begin to esteem Father rightly. They will begin to see Jesus as he truly is, and you'll be glad with exceeding joy. Remember what he said? He said, this is my strategy for victory and success, that you love one another. It's my strategy. It's not your strategy. It's my strategy. So it's my strategy, my result. You can trust me to pull it off. All I'm asking you to do is be a conduit. Quit judging him according to the flesh, right? I'm not going to go through verses 14 through 16 right now because there's more clarification on this concept of suffering. I may get into that next week. But I want to go down to verse 17 as we start to wrap this up now, because verse 17 is another place that's it's difficult for those who've been preconditioned by the evangelical fundamentalist, interpretation or rendering of, live in verse 3, pay the piper in verse 5, and they're all going to give an account. When you've been preconditioned by that, verse 17 seems to fall right in line with that exclusive statement. But when you look at verse 17 and the idea and the understanding of inclusion, it says something entirely different. First of all, listen, for the time has come for judgment to begin at the house of God. And how many times have you heard people talk about the house of God being judged? Even the church is going to be judged. See? Well, first of all, the word "at" there is a careless rendering. The word is "from." Now listen, this word is translated 393 times as "from" in the New Testament, and only 9 times "at." So the implication here is that the time has come for judgment to begin from the house of God. Let's get that part first. Where is judgment supposed to be originating from? The house of God, right? It's not judgment directed upon the house of God. It's judgment flowing from the house of God. That's the first thing we got to get. It's not judgment coming from God. It's judgment coming from the household of God. You getting that? The time has come, right, he says here, for judgment to begin flowing from the house of God. Now remember, the time has come was then, not now. I mean, now is still included, but it was then. The time has come. What time? Well, the end. The end of all things is at hand, he said previously, right? The purpose has been fulfilled, and now judgment can begin to flow from the house of God. Okay, let's just take that part first, right? All right, so the judgment that's to be flowing from the house of God is that John 5:27 judgment, where the sons are called on to what? To implement a new course of events in the earth. Remember that? He has given the Son authority to execute judgment on the earth. And we saw that means to implement a new direction, a new course of events is what he's talking about. That's what judgment is, okay? So the judgment that's to be flowing from the house of God, the time has come, see, for the sons of God now to begin to implement a new course of events on the earth, right? What is that new course of events? That's what we're reading about. Loving your enemy. Being generously hospitable to those who oppose you. That's a whole new course of events, ladies and gentlemen. That wasn't what these people were accustomed to. That wasn't what we were to take up as the sons, right? That isn't what's going to deliver the creation from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God, is it? See? So this is the judgment that's to be flowing from the house of God. Judging people with sound judgment. Judging them as God judges them, not as our flesh has judged them. That's the judgment that's supposed to be flowing from the house of God, right? Said, and that time came. The word krima here, judgment, means a decree. A decree. So, and again, the groundwork has been laid for this by Peter in the previous verses, right? So the decree that they will give the same account as we. The decree that they are already included. That's the judgment that is to be flowing from the house of God. The judgment that these two are already his children. They're already the Father's. They just don't know it yet. All right? The decree that they will give the same account as we, that they're already included. Remember verse 6 said, for this reason the gospel was preached, so that they'd know that. The gospel that we're to preach is a gospel that declares to them, you're already saved. You're already covered. You're already a part of the family. You've never not been a part of the family. He picked it up. He picked it up as soon as he realized, yeah, good job, son. See, here's the thing. If this judgment, if this judgment is decreed from the house of God, then he goes on, listen to this, and says, what will be the end of those who do not obey the gospel? Now, I want you to hear this in a different light now. Because before it sounded like, boy, those that don't obey the gospel are in way over their heads and there ain't no coming up, right? But that's not what he's saying. He said, if this judgment begins to be decreed, what judgment? That they are already included. If this judgment begins to be decreed from the house of God, he's just asking a question. What then will be the end? And this is that other word again. What will be the end of those who don't obey the gospel? The implication here is what? They will come to understand who the Father is. They will come to understand who the Son is. They'll begin to see Jesus. They'll begin to see the love that has embraced them from before time began. That's the end. The word telos also indicates an end to a particular state or condition. And in this case, it's it's a state of mind. What will be the end of the state of mind of those who do not obey the gospel? If we begin to decree, instead of arguing with ourselves about it, instead of trying to find verses to disprove inclusion, instead of going to our favorite editor who can absolutely prove it, right? If we just begin to look into our heart and see in our heart, that stuff we used to believe can't possibly be true. That's what your own heart ought to be telling you. And I'll tell you what, most of the people that I'm hearing from have been persuaded by their own heart, not by the variety of scriptures that are available to us. Okay? I love the scriptures. I teach out of it every week. But the point is, it ought to be a heart persuasion. Okay? So the message then is what will be the end of those who do not obey God. This message is further confirmation that the deliverance of the human creation from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God begins with our developing sound judgment and saying what God says of all men. Right? Got that part? Now we go to verse 18, which in one swoosh invalidates everything I've said for the last 2 weeks. Some of you just couldn't wait for me to get here because you were way ahead of me saying that sucker's playing right into a trap. He's going to get down here so far and it's going to bite him right on the rear and he's going to have to say, well, that's all for today. Let's read this out of this version. If the righteous one is scarcely saved, where will the ungodly and the sinner appear? And there's various versions of that all kind of sound pretty terrible. All right, according to every single version that I've got, and I got a ton of versions of the Bible at home, when you go to this passage, it is supposed or said to be a quote from Proverbs 11:31. All right, let's go to Proverbs 11:31. Proverbs 11:31. Now remember, let me get back over here where I have it so I can read it to you and we can see how closely it compares. If the righteous one is scarcely saved, where will the ungodly and the sinner appear? Proverbs 11:31. If the righteous will be recompensed on the earth, how much more the ungodly and the sinner? Well, that sounds a little bit, because we've heard recompense always in a negative light. However, let me read you what the New American Standard says, and I'm reading it this way because, I'll tell you why in a minute. Here's what the New American Standard said. If the righteous will be rewarded on the earth, how much more the ungodly and the sinner? Now, rewarded is the best understanding for you and I because this is the word shalom, which comes from shalom, or produces the word shalom. I'm not sure which direction it goes, but anyway, this word that's used here in the Hebrew is shalom, and here's what it means. Now listen to me carefully. This is what it means. It means to be in a covenant of peace, to be at peace, to be complete, to be sound, to be made whole, to be restored, to be repaid. It never means to be punished or separated or excluded. Now sometimes we think recompense, because again, we've been taught that recompense, but the word is rewarded. So here's what it says. If the righteous will be rewarded in the earth, that's important too, in the earth, how much more the wicked and the sinner? Rewarded in the earth, dwelling in a covenant of peace, be at peace, be complete, sound, made whole, restored, repaid. If the righteous are going to be at peace, to be complete and sound and made whole and restored and repaid in the earth, how much more the wicked and the sinner? See, we thought verse 18 was going to wipe out my last 2 weeks' messages. But all it does is bring it to a conclusion, brings it to a conclusion. And so therefore he goes on. Let me get back over here to wrap it up. Last thing I'm going to say here. That's a lie, but anyway. So let's read it like that in verse 18. If the righteous will be rewarded in the earth, how much more the wicked and the sinner? Verse 19 begins with therefore, meaning because the wicked and the sinner will be rewarded in the earth, he says, commit yourself to him in doing good. In doing what? In loving fervently, in being generously hospitable, right? In serving the needs of your opponent. Since the righteous and the unrighteous are going to be rewarded in the earth. In the earth. Not in eternity. This is about in the earth. This is about salvation. This is about being saved, sozo. In the earth. Right? So commit yourself to him in doing good, knowing he is a faithful creator to all of his creation. Any of that make any sense? Did you get anything out of that? Now, like I said, if you weren't here last week, go back and when it gets up, go back and listen to last week's. Because I think, the early part of the chapter is so absolutely, completely, what's the word? It's been so distorted in our understanding. But it's so very clear when we begin to see where Peter's coming from and where he's going. So anyway, we're going to eat together.